Well, it might seem like road construction never ends, but on my N-scale project layout, all the major road construction is finally done. So today, I'm going to show you how I built all the roads on this 2x4 foot N-scale layout. Okay, so I realize I'm releasing this video out of order. I've already showed you videos on installing structures and guardrails and things like that. But sometimes I just can't get the editing done in time to keep my weekly release schedule, so things kind of got out of order. But I am catching up, I think, and so hopefully the rest of the videos in this series will be in a more logical order. Okay, first let's look at this upper section that I built, which has a small town area with a road that curves down from a higher to a lower area. And for a road like this, it's usually easier to build it out of plaster or a material like that because you can control the slope and varying width and shape of the road a lot easier using plaster. You can still build a road like this with styrene or another material, but it's just a lot harder to get everything cut to the exact right shape when you have a complex shape like this one. But before I could build the road surface, I needed to build the road base, and in this case, that was a piece of foam that I cut to the general size to give the slope and shape that I needed to fit around the structures I planned to install. For the actual road surface, I just used some joint compound because I already had that on hand, but you could use another plaster like Woodland Scenic Smooth It or something along those lines. Before starting on the road surface, I installed some of my retaining walls, but I didn't want to show you that because it was top secret. Well, actually, I just can't find the footage, but what I did was use some chipboard for most of the retaining walls. That's kind of the cardboard you see on the back of a notepad, something like that. And then I used a curved piece of styrene along the roadway since it's a little bit easier to cut and bend the styrene than the chipboard. Installing the road surface was just a matter of taking the joint compound and smoothing it all over the areas where I wanted to have roads or other base areas, and also to fill in all the gaps along the retaining walls. Once I got that first coat of plaster on, I used some wood filler and spread that along the edges of the retaining walls to help lock them in place, since wood filler dries very hard and it's very easy to work with and kind of gets put on pretty much like a caulk. Now for the top area, which is just totally flat, I just used a piece of styrene for the road base area, and that served as the roadway for the entire top area. And later I would add on the areas for the sidewalks and the structure bases. I just cut this first layer to the proper shape and then cut a hole for the wires here that go to the tracks. And the wires come through this top area because I plan to have the controls for this little top area mounted inside two of the structures on that back corner. And to attach the styrene, I just spread a layer of tacky glue on the entire surface of the styrene, pushed it in place, and then added some weights to hold it while the glue set. Then I took more of the plaster to smooth out the transition from the curved road area to the flat area on top, and then also went ahead and filled in some of the low spots on the remaining road sections. And while that was drying, I worked on the other structure base areas. I cut one out for this middle level here, glued that in place with some tacky glue, and then glued on some additional retaining walls around that middle level. Next, I glued on the base areas for the lower structures, and again, that wasn't just the base for the structures, but also served as the sidewalk areas for that lower section. I did need a sidewalk area to go from that lower section to the upper level, and so I worked on adding some stairs in a few different areas. For the top one, I had to shim up the staircase that I used, which came from a Walthers kit, by adding on 2 thin layers of styrene underneath it to bring it up to the proper height. I then added on 2 more staircases lower down to complete this curved ramp and staircase area going from the upper level to the lower level. Next, it was just a matter of sanding the road area smooth, adding on another skim coat of plaster, and then repeating that process much like doing drywall joints. I probably added 4 or 5 thin coats of the joint compound along with light sandings in between each coat to get the roadway area smooth enough to my liking. Now for the top part of this upper section, I added on 2 more pieces of styrene to serve as the sidewalk and structure base areas. Here you can see how the overall road and sidewalk areas were shaping up. Now I used some more wood filler against the retaining walls in the back as well as along the edge of the road on the bottom here to protect the edge of the plaster road from chipping every time I try to remove or reinstall this upper section of the main layout. At this point, it was time to do the painting, and I painted the main structure base areas a concrete gray color, and that was just a mix of gray colors to kind of give a rough general concrete color for those structure base areas and sidewalks, and I used the same paint on the retaining walls as well. Next, I mixed up some chalk gray paint as well as a medium gray paint in an attempt to produce an asphalt-like tone of gray. I painted that on the asphalt roadway areas and then just used a small brush to get the paint into all the edges along the sidewalk and structure base areas, as well as along the edges of the retaining walls. Once I finished this first coat of paint, I needed to clean off the tops of the rail heads, and I realized I needed to push the plaster down a little bit along the edges of the rails. Otherwise, every time I tried to clean the rails off, I would end up rubbing the paint off the adjoining road areas. So I used a flathead screwdriver and just ran that along each side of each rail to help scrape away and push down the plaster about a millimeter or so along each side of the track. I was then able to touch up the paint in those areas and a few other places on the upper section to pretty much finish the painting. But the gray color just didn't look quite right, and so I came back and later painted things a darker gray color, which you can see here. Now this didn't look right either, but the idea was that if I made it darker, I could lighten everything with some weathering powders and kind of eventually get the color I wanted. And so to do that, I used these pan pastels. These weathering powders I've had for years, and I really like using them. They go on really nicely and they adhere really well. So I used a couple gray colors and a grimy black color and just more or less scrubbed those into the painted surface. And the pan pastels, again, adhere really well, but you might spray on a coat of dull coat or some other kind of sealer if you are worried about them wearing off over time. But as you can see, I used the lighter grays to help lighten up the color of the road and the grimy black color to help simulate those darker streaks you see down the middle of each lane on a roadway. And eventually I had a roadway that I was pretty much happy with, and I think it looks like a reasonable approximation of an asphalt road. Now, road markings, cracks in the pavement, signs, all that kind of stuff, that will all be the subject of another video. I did use the same weathering powders on the retaining walls, as well as all the sidewalk and structure base areas to kind of blend everything together and make everything look more or less similarly old and aged. And with all that done, it was time to work on some of the surrounding scenery. First, I painted the rails with something along the lines of a burnt umber color, and then I scraped off the rail heads with a piece of wood before moving on to the rest of the scenery. I ran a bead of white glue along the track and put on a first layer of ballast, which I smoothed out with a paintbrush, and then added some dirt along the edges of the retaining wall. I sprayed everything down with isopropyl alcohol as a wetting agent, soaked everything with a diluted mix of matte medium to secure it in place, and then when that was dry, I came back and did a second layer of everything. I also added on some ground foam during this next layer along the edges of the retaining wall and on the outside edge of the track. I secured the ballast and ground foam in place and then added some ground foam here and there along the edges of the retaining walls and other spots on the upper level to kind of finish up that initial coating of scenery. And so you can see here that this roadway area was pretty much complete at this point. Again, the road details still need to be done, and that'll be covered in a different video, but overall, the roadway surface itself was more or less done on this upper level. So it was time to move on to the middle level of the layout, doing the roadway there and the structure base areas. And for this part of the layout, I used a completely different technique since it was pretty much just one big flat surface. So I decided to try using Gator Board. And I've never actually used Gator Board before. It looks pretty much just like a regular foam core board, and if you didn't actually hold it, you would be hard pressed to tell which was which. But instead of basically two sheets of poster board with a layer of foam in between, the Gator Board is actually two thin plies of wood with foam in between. So basically it's like a ply of plywood on either side of that middle layer of foam. And that makes it extremely strong. And here I'm stacking up batteries on this 1/4 inch piece to show you how strong the board is. It's actually 13 pounds of batteries on the right hand side of that board, plus obviously a lot more on the other side as a counterweight. And the board bends, but it just doesn't break. Anyway, all I did was to cut pieces of the Gator Board to size to fit along the tracks and to cover all the road and structure base areas on this part of the layout. I just used wood glue to attach everything in place after I cut them to size and just stuck them down and held them down with some batteries to serve as weights. And then once everything had dried, because I like wood filler so much, I used it to blend in the edges of all the base areas with the surrounding scenery. I also used it to fill in the seams and gaps between the individual pieces of Gator Board to help blend everything together. I sanded all the wood filler smooth once it had dried, and then moved on to working on the grade crossings. And for those, I just made those using thin pieces of styrene. And what I did was to cut the styrene pieces to size to fit all the grade crossing areas I needed to do, including the pieces between the rails. But I needed to blend all those into the surrounding Gator Board itself, and I could have just glued them in place and then used more wood filler or putty to kind of blend in the styrene to the Gator Board base areas themselves. But I decided to actually try cutting off that top layer of wood on the Gator Board so everything would be a little bit more smooth and even in the transitions. So I placed each piece of styrene where I needed it and used that as a template to cut through the top layer of wood veneer on the Gator Board around the edge of that styrene piece. Then I just sliced off that top layer, and that gave me just the right amount of recess to accommodate the top piece of styrene. And I used a combination of wood glue and super glue to attach the styrene pieces, and mainly just used a super glue where the styrene was only being attached directly to the track itself, such as between the rails. And once the glue had set, I used more wood filler once again to smooth out the transition between the styrene and the Gator Board. I sanded all those areas smooth once the wood filler had dried, and here you can see everything installed and ready for paints. So next I taped off the rails and sprayed everything with both a gray and a light tan colored spray paint. I was trying to achieve subtle variation in color and kind of a modeling texture with the two courses of paint kind of going back and forth from one color to the other. But for the road itself, I plan to again have that be more of an asphalt look. So once the paint had dried, I masked off the areas for the roadway and painted those a darker gray color. And then after pulling the tape surrounding the road, I took a small brush and reworked those edges to have a nice sharp dividing line between the road and the concrete areas. And once the paint was dry, I again broke out my supply of weathering powders and went to work weathering the road and concrete areas with a mix of gray, black, and earth-colored powders, pretty much like I did on the top section. And everything does look a little bit goofy here with the weathering, but just keep in mind that most of this will be covered up by structures, and so I wasn't trying to actually weather everything evenly across all of the entire base areas. And you can see here that everything looks quite a bit better once the structures are in place. And finally, I wanted to do a bit of scenery work down here as well, and so I painted some glue on top of these little raised curb areas I had installed to divide the road area from the parking areas. I sprinkled on some ground foam and then applied some static grass. And then after vacuuming off the excess, I decided to start adding on some of the fences as well. I use these easy to install Woodland Scenics fence kits for which you just need to drill a hole where each of the posts go, apply some glue, and then attach the fence sections. But in practice, you're going to end up breaking off probably half of those fence posts since they're just thin pieces of styrene, and so make sure you have enough glue on the bottom edge of the fence to help secure it in place if you end up doing that. And probably it's almost just easier to cut off all those little plastic pins and then just glue them directly in place using glue on the bottom edge of the fence sections. And so anyway, with that, you can see I now have most of the infrastructure done on the layout. I just need to finish painting and installing structures, finish the ballasting and surrounding scenery, and then install the backdrops. And so watch for those projects coming up soon. But anyway, that's all for now, and thanks for watching. Bye.